Okay, I want to talk about arrays. Arrays are, you're going to encounter arrays frequently, and there's a one specific type that you'll actually encounter quite a bit if you're using some of the frameworks to help organize your the flow of your web applications, and we'll cover both of those. So first, we'll just talk about just sort of your basic array, and I'll show you what the syntax is like to create an array. And to give you an idea of what that is, an array is a collection of objects. And I say objects because it can be really anything. It could be a collection of integer values, it could be numbers, it could be a collection of strings. An array can be a collection of actual objects, which you'll have a better understanding of as you get more deep into object-oriented programming. When you're defining classes and creating instances of those classes. We'll keep it simple for now. We'll work with sort of the basic primitive types, and I'll show you some arrays with integer values or numeric values and strings and how to set those. So this is the syntax for it. We'll set a variable. We'll call it numbers, and what we'll do is we'll create a new array using the array function. And we will make this only odd numbers. So we'll say 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. So what numbers is it's really a collection of multiple numbers, those numbers being 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. To output it, and this is where I'm a little unsure of myself here, to output the array itself, there is a function, I'm not too familiar with it, I think it's print R, yeah, for readable, print readable. Let me try this, and we'll just run over to the screen real quick and see if that gives us what we're looking for. Yeah. So what this is going to do is it's it's not ideal to read, but it shows you that what this is it's an array, and it's got a value of 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. Now what these values in brackets are the index. And in PHP and in most languages actually, anytime you're working with a collection, you're working with an array like this, the index is going to be a 0 index to start. So you always start with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Which means if you have an array of 5 elements like we do here, your maximum index is going to be 4. And the reason is because your starting index is 0. It's very common. So if this is your first time programming, that may be a little unusual to you. But that's very common. And getting used to that is going to help you along, especially when you venture into other programming languages. So to give you an example of that, let's go ahead and output the first element of this array called numbers. And we do that using this square bracket syntax. We specify the index that we want as 0. So saying that we want to see what the value of index 0 in the array numbers are, what we can anticipate is that's going to give us the first element in this array, which is the number 1. Let's have a look and see. Sure enough, that's what it does. So if we were to say, give me element 4 and count with me, this first one is 0, this is 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can expect that if we ask for index 4, we're going to get the value 9 on the screen. We'll take a look, and sure enough, we do. If we try to go out of the boundaries of the array, it should tell us that we're silly. In fact, in this case, it doesn't tell us anything, and that may be because of the settings that I've got in PHP. It should output some sort of an exception or something, at least I would think. It's not telling me anything. And that could just be a misunderstanding of the fundamentals of PHP and error handling. It could just be that it's trying to reach something, it's not seeing it, and it's just not telling me about it. In other languages, that would really be a real problem, and it would give me a pretty elaborate exception on my screen. In this case, it's not doing that. So I'll see if I can research why that is and get a better understanding of that, and perhaps I can amend this video in the future. Let's see, what else do we need to know about arrays? There is actually something else that I discovered about arrays in PHP that just totally blew me away. I'll show you what that is. So we'll say, here's an array, we're going to call it collection. All right, and we'll use the array syntax to create a new array. We'll say that the numbers are going to be 1, 4, 6, and then I'll say instead of a number, I'm going to include a text string of 7. And a text string of 9, or actually We'll just say hello. Right? So what I've got here is I've got an array of 5 elements. The thing that's unusual to me about this is that this is totally legal syntax. You can do this in PHP. I can't do this in Java. If I wanted to try something like this in Java, the compiler wouldn't let me get away with it. If you create an array in some of the strongly typed languages, the type of the array is going to determine what it can actually contain, which means if I create an array of integers in another language, it's only going to be integers. In PHP, it doesn't have that restriction. It says go ahead and create a collection of whatever, and it'll just handle it. So if I say, let's output using the print r function, let's take a look at this collection and see, did it actually do what we're expecting? Did it create an array of 1, 4, 6, and then these 2 strings? When I look at it, sure enough, that's exactly what it's done. It's pretty unusual for me. I'm not used to seeing something like that. Ordinarily, I would expect it to say, hey, look, I want an integer array or I want a string array. This concept of mixed is pretty new to me. It's actually kind of fascinating. The only thing as I'm wrestling with, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? I'm not too sure. I don't know what a good use case is for something like this, but there certainly must be one because PHP seems to allow it. Let's see. There's a couple of things that you probably also want to know about an array as far as these basic arrays are concerned. Let me show you how to update or append an array. The syntax is pretty straightforward. If I wanted to update, let's say, the 3rd element in this array, so index number 2, which is 6 right now, if I wanted to make that something different, I would say, well, let's go ahead and let's set index number 2 to, we'll say 5. So instead of seeing 6 over here in index number 2, we should see 5 when we refresh our screen. I see nothing. Oh, shoot. That's because I did something wrong. I took out that. Hold on a second. It's a rookie mistake. Let me do this. We'll say index 2 is equal to 5. This time, I won't eliminate the echo of the array to the screen. Right. This time I see that index number 2 has been changed to 5. Now, if I wanted to just add a new element, so tack something on here to the end, the way I would do that is I would say collection. I would just include empty square brackets, and then I would include an integer value of 10. It could be anything. In this particular case, I'm going to put in a 10. So what we're doing here is we're initializing the array. We're making it 1, 4, 6, and a string of 7 and hello. Right off the bat, before we even output anything to the screen, we're going to change index number 2 from 6 over to 5, and then we're going to add a new element of 10 by using the empty square brackets. Let's see what that does for us. It does what we expected. So index number 2 is now 5. And then at the very end, after these 2 strings, we have an index of 5 with a value of 10. So that's sort of the basics of arrays. There's array functions that I like to cover with you, but first I want to show you the associative array. Associative arrays can be described as key value pairs, which is a really sort of a basic way of saying you've got a collection of objects, but the difference is as far as working with their order and identifying them or extracting them by way of their index, you're instead referencing them with a label, which is commonly referred to as the key. So I'll show you an example. So I think seeing it's going to give you a better sense of what I'm talking about. We'll say we've got an associative array called personal details. And we'll say, let's go ahead and make that, we'll say first name. Right, that represents the key. The value is going to be John. And we'll include another element in this associative array. We'll call it last name. And we'll give that a value of Johnson. Easily one of the most original names I could have come up with. So the syntax here being, instead of just creating a simple object, what you're doing is you're creating first a key. You're using this equals and then the greater than symbol to point to its value. So it's key right here. First name, value is John. Key, last name, right? Value is Johnson. So It's a little bit more complex, but the idea is still the same. You've got two elements. The difference is that they are identified with a key or a label so that you can extract them that way as opposed to using the index. So, for example, if we wanted to echo the last name only, we'll say personal details. And in the square brackets, instead of saying give me element number 1, we would say give me last name. So when I echo that to the screen, what I should see is Johnson, and that's what I see. And then obviously first name. I should see John, and I do. So that's kind of the basics of it. It's key value pairs, and if you can understand associative arrays, then you'll understand, I think, one of the common features of a lot of the frameworks where you've got this separation of concerns and you're doing some work and outputting values that's going to get picked up by the view layer of your application. It's not something to worry about right now, but if you can understand these basics, then you'd understand that when you come across it. It's something that I encountered pretty frequently at the DrupalCon convention over the course of the week there in downtown Los Angeles. Let me show you some of the functions that allow you to manipulate arrays. Before I get into that, there is a shortcut syntax I do want to show you. It's pretty specific to the PHP type that you're running. I'm running PHP version 5.4. That is not the latest. I think they're actually above 5.5 now at this point. But if you're using PHP 5.4, one of the ways that you can initialize an array, so we'll say here's an array called names. So what I was doing was this, right? I was saying here's an array of string names, Mike, Jim, and Joe, right? And you can output that array using the printr function and specifying the array of names, and that would give you output of all of your names, right? But if you wanted to create an array with a shortcut syntax, you could do this, right? Mike, Jim, Joe, and it does the same thing. So something else to look at as far as creating your arrays is concerned. If you're using the latest version of PHP, there's kind of an easier way to do it. And if there's ways to actually do something that's a little bit less verbose, I tend to sort of lean in that direction. Let me show you some of these functions for arrays. I'll go ahead and set some up here. We'll set up an array of numbers. I'll use my shortcut syntax to do so, and we'll do it like this. We'll say 6, 3, 9, 5, and 1. And what I'll do is I'll echo that to the screen so you can have a look at what I'm doing here. Okay. So here's numbers, and that should show you everything I just initialized. So in index 0, we've got 6, all the way up to index 4, where we have 1. That's pretty straightforward. We've already covered that, but let's go ahead now instead, and we'll use some of these functions to kind of manipulate them. So there's two functions I wanted to show you. One of them is called sort. So we will, here, let me do it in a couple of places. We will sort the array using the sort function, right? We'll reference numbers in there. So what I'm doing, just so you can see the syntax, is I'm doing this in the print function. I'm saying sort numbers like that, but I'm doing it inside this print function. Okay, I'll eliminate that and I'll just do it here in this one spot so you can have a look at what we're doing. When we sort an array, shoot, did I screw that up? I must have. I just have 11. Hold on. Let's try this instead. Let's do this. We'll say numbers. We'll say sort. Sort numbers. Numbers. Let me do that. Okay, there we go. That's what I was looking for. So what I've done is I've initialized an array 6, 3, 9, 5, and 1. I've said let's sort the numbers, and then we output them to the screen. And what that's done is it's sorted them in ascending order. It's recognized that they're numbers. and it said, well, the lowest one is 1, the highest one is 9. We'll sort them accordingly, and that's what it's done. And then one of the other options that you've got is a function called rsort, and that will take the array that you've got. It'll have a look at all the objects that are in that array, and it'll sort them in reverse order accordingly, like so. So now we start with 9. It goes down to 6, 5, 4, etc. So when you're using, and let me get back to sort. When you're using this function, it's going to sort according to the object type. So if you're working with numbers, then it knows that it's going to sort in ascending or descending order based on what the number is. If you're working with strings, it's going to try to alphabetize them. I'll show you an example of that. So we'll say zebra, we'll say Mike, we'll say Joe, and we'll say Bill. Okay? When I sort these, we should see them in alphabetical order, starting with Bill, ending with zebra, which is exactly what we see. And of course, our sort is going to be the same thing in reverse order. Zebra should be the first thing that we see, and then Bill should be the last thing that we see, which is exactly how it is. When you're working with numbers, actually, when you're working with any array, there's useful things that you can, useful functions rather, that you can use when you're iterating over the collection. So when you get to the point in these tutorials where we're covering actual flow control and looping and that sort of thing, you'll see me probably reference this function from time to time. So let me initialize an array, and I'll just show you what I'm referring to. I'll say, let's set a value of total, and we'll make that set by invoking a method, or a function rather, called count, and we'll include the array of numbers. And what we want to do then is just output, I can simplify this a little bit and say, let's just go ahead and output total. So what this function should do is it should count the total number of elements inside this array and let you know how many there are. We know that we put 6 numbers in here. So what we would expect to see is the number 6 on the screen, which we do. The other one, especially when you're working with a numeric array, excuse me, I'm setting my value here. Let me set a string to value, or a variable rather, called value, and we'll use this function, which is called min. And I'll output that. This is gonna look at your array. It's gonna evaluate the objects and say, here's the minimum that you're requesting, which in this particular case is 1. And then obviously you've got max as well, which shows you the max number. In this case, it's 9. Let me go to my browser. There are a couple of functions that I wanted to show you as well. I'm not too familiar with them, so I need to bring up the documentation. I go to php.net. Anytime I'm working with any sort of an elaborate API that I'm not too familiar with, I've always got the documentation up on my screen so that I can go and look at the arguments that are in a particular function and have a better understanding of how that function works. And as you're learning a new language, this is definitely key. You want to do this as well. It might be a good idea if you're learning PHP to go ahead and bookmark php.net, particularly the documentation tab, and make heavy use of the search bar. So inArray is a function that I know allows you to check for a specific element in an array. It should return a true or a false, which I think is handled a little bit differently in PHP, and I'll kind of discover that with you now in this video. But if you've got an array, and you're working in a specific system where you might be getting this array from outside sources or from user input or whatever, you may not necessarily know what the values are that you've got in this array or this collection. In this case, we do, because we're specifically initializing the array here. But there's going to be cases where you're going to be working with collections where you're not going to know the origin. You're not going to know what the values are, but you're going to want to take action if you find a value that you're looking for. So let me show you an example of how inArray can help you do that. So the function is called inArray. I'll go back over to the documentation. The documentation takes 2 arguments at a minimum. It looks like there's an optional value here at the end, an optional argument called strict. We're just going to work with the first 2, because what we're looking for in this example here, he says search as haystack for needle, right? Needle represents the item that you're looking for in the array. Haystack represents the actual array itself. So we'll use that syntax. Let's say we want to look for a specific element in our array. We would say, show me if the number 4 exists in our numbers array. If it does, we should see a Boolean output of true. If it doesn't, we should see false. And I think this is where I'm unsure how PHP handles Booleans. We'll find that out right now, I think. So when I refresh the screen, the inArray function is going to evaluate numbers. It's going to look for the number 4. And if number 4 exists, it's going to somehow indicate to us that it does. Okay, so my guess here is that PHP is indicating with the number 1 that it does in fact exist. So number 1, which isn't totally uncommon, represents the value true in a Boolean situation. So it's saying 1 or true or yes, in fact, 4 does exist. So just to make sure that we're on track there, I'll ask for a number that I know does not exist in my array. And it might either, in this particular case, it might either show us as 0 or it may show us nothing. And it looks like it's showing us nothing. So in the case of a PHP Boolean response in a function, 1 is going to represent an answer of true, and nothing is going to represent an answer of false. So that's good to know. So just to make sure that we're not totally crazy there, I'm going to request, is 7 in this array? It should come back with a 1, and it does. So there's another function I wanted to look at, which is array push. And that's, again, I'm not 100% sure of the arguments here, and that's why I wanted to look it up, because in this particular case, you're actually referencing the array as the first argument, and the item that you're going to push into the array is the second argument. So in array push, what it is here, as it says here in the documentation, is you're going to push one or more elements onto the end of an array. So if I wanted to add something to this array, one of the ways for me to do that is to make use of the function array push. So I'll say array push. I'll reference my array, which is numbers, and I'm going to say I want to add the number 50. And then to make sure that that actually worked, we'll do a print r, and we'll, how to spell numbers, we'll output the numbers array, and just make sure that array push evaluated the array and tacked on 50 to the end of it. Let's see if that worked for us. And it did. It did. So we'll go back to the documentation and we'll look at array pop. That's another one. The array pop function takes the last element of the array and drops it. There's occasions when you might be just wanting to kind of lop off the end of your array over the course of time, or iterating over it, or whatever. Array pop is a really simple way to do it. It takes a single argument, which is the array. And all you're going to do is say, hey, take the last element of the array off. So right now what we've got, when we look back at our screen, is we've got an array, right here. We've got an array of 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and then we use array push to add 50. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, go ahead and pop the end of that array. That array is called numbers. And then we'll print that to the screen as well and see that it did what we were expecting. So what we're hoping is going to happen is it's going to first go ahead and do an array push and add 50 to that array. We'll output it to the screen. Then right afterwards, we're going to drop the last element of that array off. In this case, it happens to be 50. And then we'll output the array again and just make sure that that happened. And just to kind of clean this up, make it a little bit easier to read, I'm going to go ahead and include a line break in HTML. So let's see how that looks. Okay. So we've got 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 50, all right? And then at this point, array pop gets executed. It drops that 50 off, so it's gone now. And to give you a sense of how that works, if we do it one more time, it should drop off the 9. And it does. I do it again, and it should drop off to 7. So we're left with an array of 4 elements, 1, 4, 5, and 6. And that's exactly what happens. So kind of an idea of how some of these arrays work. Arrays are pretty critical. I think you'll use them a lot. I know that I use them a lot in multiple different languages and platforms, and they're pretty key when you're working with frameworks. So if you're going to get into web application development, having an understanding of arrays is really, really important, because a lot of the output that you do to the screen is abstracted away from the actual code and logic that you're writing. And you communicate a lot of those values to your HTML layers using arrays. So it's not something that you'll have to fully understand when you're learning the fundamentals and the basics of PHP. But knowing the arrays and how they work, and knowing the API as far as the functions to manipulate and change them is pretty key, and it'll serve you later in the future. We'll cover a couple more things down the road in other videos. We want to make sure that we're still covering string manipulation. We want to cover, like I mentioned before, conditional and a control logic. So we'll do all that in future videos. For right now, I think you got enough. We'll stop it here, and we'll pick it up in the next video.